area, not a walled city. But the bottom line is houses in a non-walled city, houses in a village or a little town, are treated as if they're fields. Okay? Now, there is a machlok. Oh, and one more category. If you donate property to the Beis Hamikdash, your makdish karta, there is no 2-year restriction period. You can redeem, because the theory is Beis Hamikdash doesn't want property, wants money. So there's no restriction. You can redeem it immediately. And you have the pro rata redemption until Yovel. But unlike sale to a private party, when Yovel comes, all the property that's been donated to the Beis Hamikdash goes to Kahanim, and they keep it forever. So what?
Personal, they own
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how. I am not aware of the methodology of whether Mel gets it or Sid gets it.
Yeah, but whoever gets it, gets it.
But whoever gets it and owns it forever. So unless there's a way to redeem the property, in other words, we want to encourage redemption for 2 reasons. One, the Beis Hamikdash doesn't want land, which costs money to maintain. They want cash to spend on their expenses. And number 2, we don't want, over the years, the entire state of Israel to be owned by the Kahanim. So there is a concept of, in the English, it wasn't that clear, redeeming by halves, they called it, which basically means if you gave money to the Beis Hamikdash and you want to get it back because you don't want the Kohen to get it, it's a couple of years before Yovel, right? So you have, in the case of the Beis Hamikdash, undisputed, you have the right to go borrow money from a bank, from another rich guy, whoever it is, use that money to pay off your debt, and then pay that guy back as you can. Or you have the right to negotiate with Hekdesh to give you credit. So you'll make a down payment and then pay the rest later. That's what the Gemara meant by halves. That's clear. You can do that with Hekdesh. Question is, can you do it with the other redemptions? Okay, that's a machlokas. According to one view, you have to come, if you sell a house in a walled city, you have to come up with the geld within a year. If you don't, tough noogies, you lose the house forever. According to the other view, if you have credit, you can borrow from the bank or some rich individual, I'm saying from the bank, to keep it in sort of modern nomenclature, or get the purchaser to give you credit and hold the mortgage. You give him a down payment and you pay him off. That's a machlokes whether you can do that. And it's a machlokes whether you can do it with houses in a walled city. It's also a machlokes whether you can do it with regard to karka. Now, the side that says you can, in the case of the walled city houses, is you lose them forever if you don't redeem it in a year. So we want to cut you some slack, and they want to let you borrow the money. With regard to the field, since you're going to get it back for free anyway, the argument is, why should we give you credit? You're going to get it back for nothing in a period of time. If you're so anxious to get it back now, have the money. Okay, so that machlokes is something we need to know in the back of our heads for the ongoing discussion, and we're going to start on Chaf Aleph, Amid Aleph, by at the beginning, the first line, okay? Tani Chada, one brisa says, Lova v'goel l'chatzoyim. One brisa says you can borrow the money or pay back in installments. Okay, Vitanya Idach, the other brisa says, Ein loiva, you can't borrow the money, but goel and redeem it, but goel l'chatzoyin, or make a deal with the purchaser to take the money in installments. Okay, so those are the two sides of the argument. Lo kasha. We're going to say those brises, the conflict between those brises do not represent an insoluble problem for us. Rabbanan, the second brisa that says you may not, is the Rabbanan. Rabbi Shimon, in the first brisa that says you can, is Reb Shimon. Okay, now there's a simon. These words are code for the players in the next discussion. Simon, Cheresh, Chavesh, and Zman. Okay, Amar le Rav Acha bereda Rav Ashi. Rav Acha asks or says to Rav Ashi, Ika lemifrach. I can challenge the brisa on the previous page, which validated its opinion with a kal v'chomer, by upslugging that kal v'chomer. Ma l'meicher bias ubate arechoima. How can you use the case of selling a house in a walled city as a proof to fields? Shechein horakaicho ligali, because we minimize his rights after he sells it. He has the 1 year window, and that's the end of that. Yovel doesn't affect it. He loses the property forever. So his redemption rights are curtailed. How can you use that as an example to show where redemption rights are not curtailed? Taimar b'makdish, will you say that the same restriction, so to speak, applies when you donate an ancestral property to the base of Mikdash? He can redeem it at any time prior to the next Yovel, even during the first 2 years. So he has a more substantial power to reclaim than the homeowner does. Okay, and therefore the kal v'chomer didn't work. Amar le Rav Acha Saba le Rav Ashi, the old Rav Acha, or else his name from birth was Rav Acha Saba, said to Rav Ashi, Mishum de Ikala Meimar Nahadar Dina. You could say that we wind up with a circular reasoning. So in order to work it out, what you have to do is look for a tzad hashava. You have to look at each case and find some commonality and see if you can utilize the commonality to derive a common halacha. Okay, teisei b'ha'atzad. So let's look for the commonality. Ma'chesoda achuza yachiach. I can demonstrate from the sale of ancestral property, because the seller, after the 2 year window, has the right to redeem it for a decreasing amount of money each year until Yovel comes. Ein lo the goel l'chatzoyin. And according to the brisa, he's not allowed to get a mortgage and borrow the money, or get the seller to give him a credit and buy it in parts. How can you say from a property that's ancestral, shechein hura koicho legal miyad, because he is restricted from redeeming it for that 2-year restriction window. He's not allowed to redeem it right away. Okay, whereas the homeowner is obviously must redeem it in the first year, meaning right away. So let's look on the other side at the houses in the walled city. And that does not have the commonality of an early restriction. That has a later restriction after 1 year. And we go round and round in circles. So the concept of redemption of a field is not the same as the concept of redemption of a house in a walled city. So what's the commonality? We could argue that the only commonality we can find is that you must pay cash. You cannot borrow or talk the seller into giving you time to pay it off. Okay? Af ani avi makdish. So now, based on that commonality, we can turn to the case of giving to the temple and say, Shenigal v'ein lo v'goel. Maybe there too, he cannot borrow the money to pay it, to buy it back, or he cannot talk the gizbor into giving him credit. Okay? Now, the notion of the commonality is what we're going to talk about next. Amalei Marzutra Bereda Rav Mari Ravina. Rav Zutra says to our friend Ravina, Ikala Mifrach, you can still upslug that Kal V'chomer. Mahat Sada Shavish Behen, what's the commonality? Shechein Hara Koicham Legal B'Shana. The area of restriction that's common to houses in walled cities and to fields is that after the first year, you cannot redeem either one. Can't redeem the house because the redemption year is up, and you can't redeem the field because the redemption window doesn't open for another year. So you could say that's the year 2 is definitely a commonality to the 2. Okay? Shechein hara koicham legal, you're restricted with regarding to Yegel b'shana shniya, year number 2. Tomer b'makdish, but when it comes to donating to the Beis HaMikdash, sheyufa kaicha legal b'shana shniya, where he has the extra power to be able to redeem it in year 1, like the house, in year 2 by its own, or in year 3, 4, 5, 6, like the field. So that gives the previous owner, the guy, the donee, the donor, I guess, much more power than in other land, another ownership environments. So Ravina, it discusses this back to Marzutra. Amar le Ravina says back to him, Mishum de Ikala Meimar, but because you could say the following. Remember, land and slaves are similar. Eved Ivri Hanimcher Li'Oivik Yochiach. We can prove up the issue by looking at the rules regarding selling a Jewish slave, or having a Jewish slave sell himself to an idolater. Sheyufa koicho ligal b'shana shniya. He also can buy himself back. Remember, we said a guy who sells himself as a slave. We'll use 6 years as an example. Selling to a goy isn't always 6 years, but 6 years, $600. So after 1 year, he can buy himself back for 500. After 2 years, he can buy himself back for 400. So, and there are no restrictions on when he can do it. Okay, Sheyufa koicho, his rights are better to redeem himself, B'shana Shniya, even in that year too. V'ein lo v'goel v'chatzoyin. And according to at least one shot, he cannot borrow the money or get the seller to give him credit and buy himself back. Here's $100 and here's an IOU for 400. Can't do that. Okay? So maybe we can apply that now to land. So now we would learn that a consecrated field may not be paid off except with cash. And the Torah has to teach that how to make an exception in the case of Makdish. Because there, the temple, who is more anxious to have money than land, will give him credit or will accept a third party's payment. Okay? Boy, me Rav Huna Bar Chanina me Reb Sheshes. We're gonna have a whole bunch of questions now. To Reb Sheshes, Hamaycher bias b'batei arechoima. Somebody sells his house in a walled city. Nigal lekroivim o ein nigal lekroivim. Does a guy have to redeem it himself? Or could a relative redeem it on his behalf? And then the relative would take ownership until he works it out with the old owner. Okay? So we make a gezerah shava legeulaso mistei achuza gemar. We find over here by the house the word geulaso, he may redeem it. And we have by the family heritage field the word he may redeem it. So it's exactly the same. We have a gezerah shava. Maso the achuza einu nig eles lechetzoyin unig eles lekroivim. Since the family field cannot be redeemed on credit, either with a loan or with partial payments, so it cannot be redeemed on credit, but it can be redeemed by relatives. Af hai nami nigal chatzoyin v'nigal akrayvim. So let's say, because of the gezerah shava, the walled city building may not be redeemed on credit, but may be redeemed by a relative. Idilma, or maybe, ki ksiva geula b'chatzayin hu dichsiv. Maybe the word redemption includes the idea of however you come up with the money, whether it's borrowed or on credit or in cash. Okay, and that's now b'chatzayin hu dichsiv. The purpose of the word is to say you can redeem it on credit. B'kroivim loksiv. But the pasuk does not explicitly have a word that you can interpret to mean relatives. Okay? So that's the question. In other words, he asked the question and then he gave his rationale for having the issue to raise the question. And Rav Sheshes says, Omer le, Rav Sheshes gives him a psak, ein a nigal. Your uncle can't redeem it, cannot be redeemed by family members, has to be redeemed by the seller. Esve. So now, either the Gemara or Rav Huna challenges that response from Rav Sheshes. Esvei, we challenge that. B'chol geula titnu. The pasuk says, all you shall redeem. What does the word all mean? My love, but they are rechaima. Doesn't the word all come to include the houses in walled cities? And since fields can be redeemed by relatives, so then the word all expands the rule to include walled cities. So we have a machlokes, yes or no. That was his reply to Rav Sheshes, who said the answer is no. So Rav Sheshes says, no, I don't like that explanation. The word kol has nothing to do with walled cities. Kol has to do with bate chatzerim, with houses in open towns. They're not fields, they're not walled cities. You have to put it somewhere. So the kol comes to say that's the same as a field in terms of the rules. But so now again, either Rav Huna or the Gemara says, how can you give that answer? There's an explicit pasuk concerning towns, city houses in towns. Okay, al soda haaretz yechashev. You think of them as if it's part of a field. So we have an explicit pasuk that says town houses. I don't mean townhouses. Houses in a town are included in the way of whatever the rules are with regarding a field. So the kol can't mean houses in a town. So that's the Gemara asks that question, and the Gemara replies that pasuk has another function. Hahu l'koivo choiva ba'aliba de Rebbe Eliezer. That pasuk comes to say that relatives are obligated to do the redemption if the seller can't, and we follow Rav Elazar, who goes through the following. We're going to do a shakla b'taria. We know that in the field, the relative has the right. The question will be, is it only a right? If he wants, yes. If he doesn't want, no. Or if you have a rich uncle, is he obligated to buy the land back and not have to wait till Yovel? That's going to be the issue. And Rav Elazar is going to hold, we'll see, that you are obligated. Getzanya, we have a brisa, the goel ace mimchar achiv, your brother shall redeem the property you sold, reshus. That gives him the right to, okay? Ata omer reshus, you're telling me he only has the right. Oh, eina ela chayva. Maybe the pasuk is making an obligation, placing an obligation on him. Talmud Loimer, so we learn the ish ki lo yihye lo goel. If a fellow has no one who can read, there's a pasuk. If a fellow has no relative to help him redeem, so the Gemara now asks a rhetorical question. Ki yesh adam b'Yisrael she'ein lo ga'olim? Is there a single human being in all of Yiddishkeit that doesn't have at least one relative somewhere? Okay, and it's a rhetorical question. Now the fact is, he could be a nuger and not have a relative. But that's lo shlicha. That's not normal. So everybody, you have at least a third cousin thrice removed. There's somebody out there that you go back far enough in the genealogy, you could that there's somebody that had two kids, and that somebody out there is your relative. So the Gemara says, "Elazeh sheyesh lo v'yeinu roitza likach shehach rishus biyada. So what the pasuk is referring to is you can't talk a relative into doing the redemption. So the pasuk says you have nobody, no relative out there is willing to redeem it. So therefore becomes a raya that it's rishus, not kol. Divrei Rabbi Yeshua. That's the words of Rabbi Yehoshua. However, Rabbi Lazar Aimer, the Goel Eis Mimcher Achiv Choiva, the concept if there's a relative out there who can afford to do so, he must redeem. So, same similar argument here. Ata Aimer Choiva, you're telling me it's an obligation? Oh, Eina Ela Rishus, maybe it's just an option or possibility. Talmud Lomer Bechol Geula Titnu. So we're using the word chol not to include another kind of property, but to include an absolute obligation to redeem. Okay. Now, but the Brisa seems to include houses in this rule of redemption. Amrele Rabbanin le Ravashi. So the rabbis say to Ravashi, the Amrela Ravina le Ravashi, and another Masorah is that it's Ravina who says it to Ravashi. But somebody says to Ravashi, Bishlan Lamanda Amrela Rabos Bate Ore Chaima. This logic of the kol meaning an obligation to redeem works perfectly if you say that walled cities are included in the rule. Hainu dixiv b'kol, that's why the word kol is there. Ela lamanda omer l'rabos botei chatzerim. But according to Rav Sheshes, who only said it includes towns, houses in towns, my b'kol. So what does he do with the word kol? Doesn't mean everything, because walled cities are excluded. Gemara says, you're right, that's problematic. Kasha. Okay. Now, we're going to try and attack Reb Sheshes again. Esvei, Abaya wants to challenge Reb Sheshes. Ma Talmud Lomer, Yigolenu, Shalosh Pamim. Why are there 3 psukim? Remember, we do Gezerah Shabbos, but we talked 2 psukim before. But there's a 3rd pasuk that talks about you shall redeem. These are regard to, technically, they're regard to a slave, a Jewish servant slave sold to a non-Jew. Okay? Yigolenu, Gimel Pam, it's in there 3 times. So each time has to add something. L'rabos kol hagu'ulos nig olos b'seder hazeh, keseder hazeh. That we want to say that whenever there's a redemption, the pattern of procedure is similar in all cases. Okay? My love, but they are a choma v'evet ivri. So now, what category is similar to slaves? We can't say it's fields or townhouses because we had psukim covering them. And if you exclude walled city houses, so you have slaves and you have that exclusion, and that's where you make the hekesh. Okay, low Gemara said, and that argues with because a relative, of course, can redeem a slave. So Rav Sheshes is probably wrong when he said a relative cannot redeem a house in a town because we were makish. Gemara says low. What the pasuk is talking about, Rish Lakish answers, Batei Chatzerim B'Sadei Achuza. The pasuk is going back to fields and townhouses. Okay? Bate chatzerim b'soda achuza b'hed. So the argument to Reb Shesha says, yeah, but we had clear psukim covering both of them. Al shoida ha'oretz yechashe. The house in the town is considered the same rules as a field. So there you don't need other psukim. You covered those both. K'da Omer Reb Nachman bar Yitzchak. The way Reb Nachman bar Yitzchak comes and said, what's going on with this third extra pasuk? K'da Omer Reb Nachman bar Yitzchak l'karov karov kaidem. Okay? In the case of a Jew being held by a non-Jew, first it's his brother, then it's his father, then it's his uncle, then it's his cousin, then it's his 13th cousin 14 times removed. So in other words, the closer the relationship, the greater that he gets priority on doing the redeeming. Only if he cannot or will not does it go to the next closest relative till you run out of relatives. Okay? And Hachinami, here too, what the Bryce is trying to tell us is Likrav Karav Kaidem, that we go in order of relationship. Okay? Exactly what was Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak talking about when he says the closest relative is first in line? Okay? Aha, the ba'aya lahu. So about that they asked, Eved Ivri Hanimchal Yisrael. When we know what by a Jew to a goy, but what about a Jew sold to another Jew? Okay, nigol lekrovim oena nigol lekrovim can, and we know that the guy can buy himself back, or the 6 years, or Yovel, he goes out. But can a relative step in and pay the pro rata fee and get him out of captivity? Nigel Krovim, who ain't a Nigel Krovim? Yes, can he? Can no, he might not. That's the question. The Rebbe, if you're going to answer in order according with Rebbe's view, lo boilach, the question doesn't exist. The Omar Rebbe says, Misha Einu Nigel Be'ela Nigel B'Sheish. If the 6 years is the longest he can be in service, then his relatives may not redeem him. And that applies a max of 6 years to all Jews owning other Jews. So according to Rebbe, there's no question. The answer is obviously no, he cannot. Okay? Alma mifra. So Rebbe it's clear, there's no question he may not be redeemed by any relative, even the closest. Key to boilach. If you want to ask the question, you have to answer it aliva de rabbanan according to the view of the other rabbis who say that you can buy him out. So can a Jew sold to another Jew, say by the court, be redeemed by a relative? So we did this a long time ago. Yalfinin socher socher. We learned that Gezerah Shava a long time ago. And therefore, all the different types of Jewish servants, the male to a male Jewish servants, to a goy, to a Jew, that the redemption does work according to the Rabbanan. V'lo darshe yigolena. So now a hypothetical question. Maybe they don't buy the notion of yigolena limiting it to relatives of a Jew sold to a goy. Maybe they expand it to a Jew sold by a Jew to a Jew. Maybe he shall redeem him, that every relative has to step up and redeem a Jew sold to a goy, does not apply in other circumstances like a Jew owned by a Jew. So let's answer. Taishma, let's look into it further. Pasuk says, we had this before, B'chol Geula Titnu, in all you have to redeem, L'Rabas Batim B'Eved Ivri. So the call comes to talk about houses in the walled city and the Jewish slave sold, the Jewish slave, period. My love, so what are we talking about? It just said houses. My love, what are we talking about? Bote Arichoma, walled city houses, the Eved Ivri Hanimchel Yisrael, and a Jewish slave owned by another Jew. Isn't that what it is? So the Brisa clearly says that his relatives may and perhaps must redeem him. Lo, not really. Eved Ivri v'nimchel v'tochavim. We're talking about a Jewish slave who's owned by a non-Jew. Eved Ivri hanimchel v'tochavim v'hed yiksibo. But there's an explicit pasuk that gives people the right, relatives, the right to redeem a Jew owned by another Jew. The pasuk says, what? I'm sorry, by a non-Jew. Why do we have to do a limud? It's explicit in a pasuk. O Dodai, or his uncle, O Ben Dodai, or his cousin, Yegolenu shall redeem him. So you do not need a limud. You have an explicit pasuk. Turn the page. Okay. Hahu l'kayva chayva. But that pasuk, whoa, remember, we just 12 minutes ago, we learned what that pasuk does. It's used up because that pasuk tells you it's not a permission slip. It's an instruction. It's already saying relatives who can afford it must redeem him. And a fila Rebbe Yoshia, and even Rebbe Yoshia, who said that the relative is not obligated to buy a field back, he is obligated to buy a relative back. Okay? So that didn't work. So let's try again. Did somebody just have a question or just sneeze? Okay. Taishma, let's look further. Ma Talmud Lomer Yigolenu Gimupa Amim. Why did different psukim come up with the word Yigolenu 3 different times? He will redeem, he will redeem, he will redeem. L'rabos kol hanigulos shenig. Excuse me. Shenigolos keseder hazeh. That wherever there's a redemption issue, the basic rules apply common to all. So therefore, wherever there's any redemption, the rules apply universally, and therefore relatives are able to redeem, and again, may be required to redeem. My love, but they are a choyma, b'yevet ivri, b'nigel Yisrael. So isn't it logical to say, well, that applies to walled cities, they're not any different. And it applies to slaves sold to Jews too, they're also not any different. So now we have the position that relatives can and perhaps must redeem a slave sold to even to another Jew. Lo. No, going back to the same old argument. Where when we say there's redemption commonality, it's only we're comparing houses in towns to fields. But same issue again. But that's explicit in the pasuk. Al soda aretz yechoshev. You must think of the house in the town as if it were a field. So you don't need any other psukim or any other limudim. So what is the point of Yigolenu, to create priorities? A brother must redeem. If he can't, it's the father. If he can't, it's the uncle. If he can't, it's the cousin, etc., etc. Omer Rab Nachman bar Yitzchak, l'koirov, korov, koidem. The closest relatives comes first. Going back to the Mishnah, we had the concept of a Jewish slave saying to his master when his term is up, you know what, I love you. And even though I wasn't supposed to, I fell in love with the Canaanite lady you stuck in my bed. And the babies she made, I'm very close to emotionally. I want to stay. I want to continue to be your slave. So that's a nirtza. And the Mishnah said, Vahanirtza nikna b'ritziya. The process of keeping the slave is you pierce his ear with they translated an awl, with the standard piercing implement. And you stick it, he stands by the door, and you stick the awl through his ear into the door. Okay, so we're going to have several issues over here. First, we're going to look at the pasuk. Uksiv v'reitza adainav es ozno b'martseya, etc. The master pierces his ear with an awl. Okay, A-W-L, not A-L-L. Okay? V'kaina es atzmo b'yovel. But even the nirtza is not till he dies. He gets out by the next yovel, or b'misas ha'adan, or if the master dies. Okay, now, uksiv va'avodo. The pasuk says he shall work for him. Okay, only the master v'lo es haben v'lo es habas, not his heir, whether it be a male or a female heir. And the pasuk says la'olam, note the missing vav, forever, meaning la'olam moshel yovel, up until the next yovel is called forever. Yeah.
I have a question. What happens if the man had a wife and children before?
He must have a wife and
Who
children.
supports them?
How? The other.
The master.
The other one has to support them.
Yeah.
Okay.
But all right, in any event, Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis teach a brisa. Martseya, using a tool called a martseya, which we are translating as all. Ainli ela martseya. That means a specific kind of all, maybe. Okay? Menayin l'rabas hasol v'hasira v'hamachet u'makdeya v'hamachtev. What about other piercing instruments? What about a sharp piece of wood? Or what about the thorn from, say, a rose bush or some long, thin thorn? I don't know. Or what about a needle, a sewing needle? Or what about a corkscrew? You know, a spiral awl type awl. Or the stylus used to make designs in metal or leather. They're all pointy objects. What about using them? Talmud loimer v'lo kachto. Before it tells you what it is, the pasuk says, take it. So the take, yeah, you could say, pierce his ear with an awl. You don't have to say, take an awl and pierce his ear. So the take word is extra, and Talmud Lom and L'Rabos Kol Davar Shenikach Biyah. Any piercing tool that may be held comfortably in a hand. So you couldn't use one of those drill press things because that's not held in a hand. Okay? Divrei Reb Yosef, Reb Yehuda. That's Reb Yosef, Reb Yehuda's opinion. Rebbe Aimer, Rebbe says you have to narrow it a little bit. Ma martzeya miyuchad shel mateches. Since your normal all is made of metal, af kol shel mateches. You're only allowed to use tools made of metal. So he would exclude the thorn and the wooden pointy spike. Okay? Davar acher. We can still darshan more from these psukim. Hamartzeya lehevi hamartzeya hagadol. That the term hamartzeya, now you have to, in the actual pasuk, it says ba martzeya. When there's a patach under the base, that's as if it said the ha martzeya. So there's an understood extra hey. Okay? Lahevi hamartzeya hagadol, to bring even a huge awl as long as you can hold it in your hand. Omer Rav Eliezer, now a new issue. So now we know with what you may puncture. Now we're going to ask exactly where do you puncture? Okay? When I was young, when girls got their ears pierced, it was always the earlobe. Now they have ear piercings even up here. So it's not unreasonable to ask, are we talking about an earlobe pierce or are we talking about the cartilage at the top of the ear pierce? That's the shaila. Omer Rav Elazar says, Yudon Beribi, the great posek Yudon, Hoya Dairesh, he would teach the following. Kishahain wrote im ein rotzim ela b'mai b'melsa. The only place on the ear that you can legitimately pierce is the earlobe. Okay? V'chachamim omrim ein. Now, this is going to be a whole limud to prove that they think it's the upper portion of the ear. And we're going to start out by saying that you can't pierce a Kohen's ear. Kohen is not eligible to stay through piercing because when Yovel comes and he goes home, he'll have a mum. And there are psukim that say he has to go back to the way things were before he could do a voda. Now, if he has a mum, he can't. So we're going to go through a whole limud like that, okay? Ein Eved Ivri Kohen, a Jewish Kohen, a Kohen who's a slave, Nirtza cannot have his ear pierced, Mipnei Shenase Balmum, because that will be a damage disqualifying him from avodah. The Im Timer Bamelasa Haim Rotzin, if you tell me that piercing the earlobe is the only place you can pierce. Heich Eved Ivri Kohen Yayase Balmum. How can you say that a Kohen cannot get this process because it's a mum? Piercing your ears is not a mum. If Mel wants, he can pierce his ears and wear diamond earrings and still do the avoda. Okay? Ha einirtza ella b'goyva shaloizen. So that's a deraya that the piercing takes place in the upper portion of the ear, in the loop at the top where there's cartilage. Okay? But my kamiflagi. So why does Rav Yossi say the earlobe and the Rabbanan said the cartilage in the upper ear? The Rabbi Darish Klal. Now, this is that old business of Klalu Prat or Klal versus Riboy Miyut Riboy. I'm going to go through the pasuk using both ways of learning and come up with earlobe and upper portion of the ear. Okay, the Rebbe Dairesh Klale Luprate. Rebbe uses the Klalu Prat methodology. Vilokachto, the first word you shall take, doesn't specify any specific instrument. That's a klal. Martseya, that says specifically an all. That's a prat. And then the pasuk goes on, ba'ozno ubedeles. Hey, the hole has to go through the guy's ear and the door. That's a klal again. Okay, so chayzer of a klal. That's a klal again. Klalu pradu klal. So we have klalu pradu klal. Ein atadan elaka ein haprat. You have to, whatever is included in the klal has to at least be in some way similar to what was in the prat. That's how Rebbe gets, okay, ma haprat mefaresh el mateches. Just like the all mentioned in the pasuk is made out of metal, af kol shol mateches. So too any piercing tool, be it a needle, be it an awl, be it a big awl, be it a corkscrew, must be made out of metal. It can't be made out of wood or stone or some other material. But he uses a different technique for darshaning psukim, and he goes lekachta riba. The first word take is a broad term. It could be almost anything. Martseya miyut. That's a miyut that limits it only to an all. But ozno ubedeles chazer riba, that comes back as an inclusive, and it means any pointy thing, even it would even include wood or stone. Veriba uma'edu riba hakol. The first riba one's just about anything. My rabbi. So what does the Torah add in? Rabbi kol mile, anything with a point. Okay? My miyet, what is the restriction? And miyot sam. You must poke the hole. You can't say drip acid on the guy's ear and let it eat a hole in his flesh. Sam here means a corrosive or a whatever liquid. They translated corrosive liquid. That's good translation. Okay. Amar mar hamartseya lahevi martseya hagadol. The Brisa told us that the word martseya comes as a riboy to even a huge all, as long as it can be handheld. My mashma, what's that trying to tell us? Kida Amar Rava, the way Rava taught. Hayorech. We're now doing a new analogy. Yaakov had a fight with an angel. He came away with a limp. And we say to this very day, we do not eat the sciatic nerve or the sinew, whatever, however you want to translate it, of the thigh. Ha miyumenes shiviyarech. So that means it's ha-yarech, the thigh. So technically that means the right thigh, not the left thigh, because that's the more important thigh. Right is always better than left. Hachanami, hamartseya, with the hay, comes to include the most chashuv all of all. So the most chashuv all of all is a big all. Okay? Now, going weiter. Back to the shaila of is it earlobe or cartilage in the upper ear. Omer Rav Elazar, Yudan Beribi, the great Yudan, Hoya Doire, she used to teach, Kishe Ein Reitzin Elaba Melasa. It has to be the earlobe. V'chachamim oimrim ein eved ivri kohen nirtza. Same argument repeated. You can't do, a kohen doesn't have the option of piercing his ear. Mipnei shenase bal mum, because the piercing would wind up being a mum. Gemara says, who cares? V'yase bal mum. Who cares if the Kohen gets a mum? Where did you get the notion he's not allowed to get a mum? Omer Rava bar Shila, Omer Kra, you can't because of a pasuk. Vashav al mishpachto. After Yovel, or after the master dies, he rejoins his family. So what does that mean? Lemuchsa shibi mishpachto. He takes the place in his family that he previously occupied, as if he had, it's like the company where it's like it never even happened. So if he was the Kohen who always did the spritzing, he goes back to spritzing. And if he has a pierced ear, he can't spritz if it's the upper portion of the ear. Okay. Iboilo. So now let's ask, we just said that a Kohen is different than another slave, at least in the regard that he cannot have his ear pierced, at least according to one shita. So are there other areas in which slave Kahanim differ from slave Yisraelim? What about, for instance, getting the bedmate? Iboy lahu evid ivri kohen mahu sheyib solo rabo shichva kanainis. Can the master increase his holdings by giving this Kohen slave a non-Jewish slave girl to procreate with? So the Gemara wants to know, is this concept a chidush? Chidush who? V'lo shana kahanim, v'lo shana Yisrael? Is it like a unique din, and we have no rationale for narrowing it? It says, give it. Let the guy have a bedmate. Okay, lo shana Kohen, the lo shana Yisrael doesn't matter. Oy dilma, shiny kahanim. Maybe Kahanim are different because they have sanctity. Hoel the Reba Bahenakasav mitzvos Yiseros. Kohanim have mitzvahs that other people don't have. And among them are marital restrictions, even with free people. So it's not a stretch to say you can't give them a bedmate. Okay, everybody understand that? Good. Rav Omer Mutter. Rav says, why you deprive the Kohen of a bedmate? He's entitled like anybody else. Shmuel, of course, always argues with Rav. Shmuel Omer Usser. Shmuel says, no deal. Now, we're going to challenge Shmuel in a sort of snide way. Okay? Omer le Rav Nachman le Rav Anan. Rav Nachman says to Rav Hanan, Ki chavisu be'mar Shmuel, when you were a Talmud in Shmuel's yeshiva, be'is kumadri italaliso. What were you doing? Playing chess? This is some kind of a board game with tokens. So I'm calling it chess. Rashi says a board game with playing pieces. So what he's saying is, how come you weren't paying attention to the shear? When Shmuel said the Kohen can't go have a bed made, you should have challenged him immediately. What were you, playing games? You weren't listening to the shear? My time low temrule meho. Why didn't you immediately challenge Shmuel by saying a brisa v'chachamim oimrim ein eved ivri kohen nirtza? The only difference for a kohen is the ear pierce. Because of Bitnei Shanasa Balmum, because of the Balmum issue. Now, if we said he also can't have a bedmate, Im Tomer Ein Rabu Meiser Lo Shecha Kanainis, typically the Beina Ahavti Es Adaini Es Ishtivi Es Bonai. The ear-piercing candidate has to declare to his master, I love my master. I love my Canaanite woman. I love my non-Jewish children. Now, if he were ineligible because he can't say that because he doesn't have the bed made, why did it go through this thing about a mum? We could have much more direct. He can't say it because it ain't true. He doesn't have a bed made in Canaanite children. Okay, but later, he doesn't have them. Okay, so the Gemara goes weiter. Sulomidi. That's the bottom line. That response would have shut Shmuel out, and the fact that it wasn't said to him is the only reason he passed in the way he did. So we now know that a Kohen can have a bed made, but cannot have an upper piercing. Okay? A boy lahu, new question. Kohen matu mipasto where. So if we had an issue with regard to the slave girl who could be or may not be a bedmate for a Kohen, how about a Kohen soldier? We have a concept that if you go out to war and you see an attractive woman, the Torah knows that people do bad things in war, and there might be raping as well as pillage. So they give them a sort of a loophole. You can take her home with you, and you can make her become Jewish. First, you make her ugly, and then you make her Jewish, and then you can marry her. Now, prior to I'm leaving out take home. Prior to the shave her head and make her Jewish and the month-long gap, there is a machlokas. You're allowed to have bia with her once. One version of that is while you're still in the war, take her into a battered building, have bia with her, tie her up, take her home. The other version is when you get her home, you can have bia with her once, and then you go, your lust is assuaged, and you can tolerate the month separation. So we're going to use Rashi's pshat, where the first bia is at home. But it doesn't matter. You could learn it either way. It's just easier to do it Rashi's way based on the wording a little bit later. Okay. Chidush, is this a strange, unique din, which means it applies to all soldiers, lo shana Kohen v'lo shana Yisroel, or Dilma shani kahanim hoel deriba behem mitzvos yiseros, Maybe because Kohanim have greater sanctity and more mitzvahs and are, quote, closer, unquote, to God. They're expected to restrain themselves more than just your stam soldier. So that's the question. They're not allowed to take a pretty girl home with them. Rav Omer Mutter. Again, Rav cuts the Kohen some slack and says he can shack up with the girl and take her home with him. Shmuel Omer Aser. Shmuel says Kohanim are better than that. They're not allowed. Now, what are they arguing about? Are they arguing about the whole deal? But be a Rishona, with regard to the first act of intercourse, be it on the battlefield or be it when she gets home. Kula alma lo pligi the shari. Even a Kohen is allowed one bite at the apple. Okay? The law dibra Torah ela keneged yetzahara. Because the whole reason for this halacha is a safety valve so Jewish soldiers don't act barbarically to the women who come under their control. Okay, so even Kohanim can have a Yetzirah. Okay, Kipligi, what are they talking about? But be a Shniya. Are you allowed to have intercourse with this woman after her hair grows back and after she goes to the mikveh and becomes Jewish? Now, a Kohen can't marry a Geores. So does that general rule apply to this lady? So he only gets to have Thea with her once, but after she's Jewish, she's a Geores and he can't. Or is this an exception to the Geores rule? That's what Rav and Shmuel are arguing about. Okay? Rav Omer Mutter. Rav says even though he's a Kohen and he normally can't marry a Geores, this case is special. Shmuel Omer Aser. Shmuel says no, it's not special. Rav Omer Mutter Hoil the Ishtarya. That once he's had sex with her once, we don't have any ground, and it was allowed. We don't have any grounds to say no deal. It's really, really unfair to tell a guy you can marry somebody, but you can't sleep with her. Okay, and he did it once, and he says, wow, this is the best sex I ever had. And now you say, tough noogies, he's not allowed anymore. That's Rob's argument. Shmuel Omer Aser, you can't. Daha havia lage a Geires. Now she's a Jewish convert. Okay, we'll just do a little bit more. Ikadamri, others explain the argument a little bit differently. Be a shniya. Everybody agrees they're allowed the first crack at the apple, but they're only arguing about the second time. Even Rav would agree she's a convert. He can't marry her. She's a convert. Keep pligi. What do they argue about? Be a Rishona, the very first act. Rav Omer Mutter, he's allowed a Kohen to have this one sexual act with her. The whole lo dibra Torah ela keneged yetzahara, because he has this overwhelming compulsion to have sex, and if we don't give him permission, who knows what he'll do. Ushmuel Eimer Aser, Kol Heiche, the Karina baby. Okay, the Ahafta Toich Beisecha, because there is a pasuk that says, when you bring her home, Karina Bevura Isa Bishivya, you see her among a beautiful woman among the booty that has been captured in the war. Kol heichadolo karina be va'ahavta estoch beiso. Whenever I say you cannot bring her home, meaning you cannot marry her because she becomes a KRS, then the reciprocal argument is lo karina be reisa v'shivya, that you cannot act when you see the beautiful woman amongst the bounty. And we'll go on a little bit later with mutiny amongst the bounty. Okay, that was very complex, and I went pretty fast. I hope everybody was able to follow me. Tune in tomorrow to talk more about this lady. You know, after reading this Gemara, I have this idea. Maybe I'll join the Israeli army. You know, we'll attack.
You're not a Kohen.
I understand. I mean, I can. They'll attack Ramallah or something, and I'll get some pretty Arab girl.
Mel ought to say that.
Well, Mel may not be able. Besides which, Mel walks with a cane, so he's clearly not able. I don't know, Mel. And I think maybe it's wishful thinking at your age.
Look who's talking. A youngster.
Well, I'm not even 80 yet.
Oh.
I've got 7 weeks till I'm 80.
Oh, really? Wow.
24th of Cheshvan.
Can I throw your party?
No.
No?
No. No, you reach a point where you don't want to be reminded.
He was born that started to call it Bar Cheshvan.
That's right.